Hello, and welcome to the debut episode of On Target, a Eurasia Group Foundation production. This is a series of conversation that I, Zuri Linetsky, a research fellow at the Eurasia Group Foundation, will be hosting with our non-resident fellows. And the purpose of this series is to talk about our non-resident fellows' research, how it might inform policy now, or what lessons we can take from their research, particularly if the research is historical, and just generally get a sense of the folks that are a part of the Eurasia Group Foundation and the wonderful work that they're doing. So with that in mind, my first guest is Aroop Mukharji. He's a non-resident fellow with us and is working on some fascinating stuff in the Indo-Pacific region. And so I'll pass it over to you, Aroop, just to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are.
Thanks, Zuri, and thanks so much for hosting these chats. I should say the folks who will be following me on this series are really do some really amazing stuff. So I'm excited to see what comes out of those chats as well. As Zuri said, my name is Aroop Mukharji. I was born and raised in Kansas City. And I am an associate at the Harvard Kennedy School, where I got my PhD, as well as a non-resident fellow, of course, at the Eurasia Group Foundation, who I'm very grateful to. And I study U.S. history in particular. I study the 1890s and early 1900s. I study presidential decision-making in particular of the McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt administrations, which is a sort of era when the U.S. rose to either some people call it major power status or great power status. And I mentioned I received my PhD in public policy at the Kennedy School. And before that, I had gotten my BA at Williams College and spent a couple years in the UK as a Marshall Scholar. So sort of my educational arc.
A tour de force of the Aroop Mukharji education arc. So what I want to talk about next is your research. You talk about the Roosevelt and McKinley years, and just for me, what years are we talking about specifically?
Yeah. So what I'm really working on at the moment in particular is just, so I wouldn't even, not even 1 year. It's maybe more a few months of 1898. 1898 was a huge year for the United States in foreign policy. Very consequential. The United States defeated Spain in the Spanish-American War. And then it was decided, and it actually sort of took over many former Spanish colonies, one of which was the Philippines. And that's really what is at the heart of my kind of current focus. The Philippines decision was a separate decision that was made by McKinley in the fall of 1898, really by one man. Several of his cabinet advisors didn't even know he had made the decision until weeks later. He made it sort of isolated while on a speaking tour in Pennsylvania. And he went back and forth for several months about what to do about the Philippines. Spain held the Philippines originally as a colonial power. After the United States defeated Spain, William McKinley decided to annex it. It's something that has plagued historians and researchers for 120 years. And I think that it's still an open question as to why he did it.
Well, I can imagine there's some presidents after McKinley who would have very much liked the opportunity to annex some places without anybody really asking them. But presumably he needed Congress to sign off on a decision to annex the Philippines.
He did, and that was through approvals, really Senate approval of the Paris Peace Treaty. And this was the Paris Peace Treaty that people forget about. Of course, there's the Treaty of Paris. Or Versailles, but it's also.
Wasn't the Paris Peace Treaty what ended Vietnam?
They also France has been the site of a lot of negotiations.
Well, you're one of the major colonial powers of the Middle Ages, and I guess the Renaissance and of history. Let's say you're going to have a lot of colonies and a lot of peace deals afterwards, I would imagine.
France was used in 1898 as a colonial power. I mean, there was a lot of prestige this is something we can discuss maybe in a later chat. There's a lot of about being considered a major power, being a site of negotiation, even whether or not you had embassies. Before there were other sorts of kind of embassy-like things called legations. It was if you had an ambassador instead of a minister, you were considered more prestigious. And these were sorts of prestige games that a lot of these countries did play. Hosting negotiations was one of those forms of prestige. But in this case, it was also practical. The Spanish used strategic, I should say. The Spanish had used the French as their representatives in DC when they had polled all the representatives during the war. So France was sort of their people, and the Spanish mistakenly assumed that if they pushed for the negotiations in Paris, they would get more concessions from the Americans. But in fact, that was not the case.
So they were like the Swiss to our Iran.
Yeah, although the Swiss are more neutral, I think the U.S. really felt that, they're Swiss or Austrians. I mean, in Vienna, of course, the first round of Iran negotiations were the.
That's right. That's right. Well, Europe, very small, same place.
Oman, I think Oman also there was a secret set of negotiations that preceded the Vienna negotiations. Yeah, I mean, these are things that are actually, obviously are very important. The U.S. would play this role with the end of the Russo-Japanese War under Teddy Roosevelt is another decision.
So the lesson here for the people that are watching this is that you want to host peace negotiations at your house whenever possible, so that you go down in history as a major power.
Yeah, I think so. You could even maybe win a Nobel Peace Prize.
That's right. So everyone come to my house and we're going to resolve everything. Right. A nice round table, so we won't spend months debating on who needs to sit next to who, which was actually a big part of the Vietnam negotiations. So let's talk about, we've talked kind of around it. Let's talk about your research is fascinating to me for any number of different reasons, but I think particularly now, given the context in which we live, we've just passed through what some people are calling the fourth Taiwan Straits crisis. That's not directly germane to your work, but it does set a wonderful stage to think about the history of the American involvement in the Indo-Pacific region.
Yeah.
So you work on a couple of months of 1898. Let's set the stage here. We have, in just a short few sentences, what is the United States doing in the Philippines? Obviously, it has something to do with the Spanish-American War. What potentially? Let's talk about what is the Spanish-American War. I mean, I have a sense, but why do we fight it? Why does it get us to the Philippines? And then we'll go from there.
Yeah. So, the United States set the stage in 1897 when William McKinley was inaugurated as president. The U.S. military was quite small. In fact, it was capped by law. The United States was very proud. McKinley was very proud of having a small army, small military, relatively and a very small navy. The Cuba is always very close to the United States and had attracted U.S. attention over the course of the 19th century. It wasn't a new issue necessarily in the 1890s, but definitely it was heating up. And the United States declared war on Spain in April of 1898 after quite a lot of brutal oppression and suppression of Cuban rebellions. The Spanish had instituted a variety of very, very tragic kind of governance measures to suppress these rebellions. And the United States intervened. McKinley intervened. Now, there are a lot of different reasons that historians have offered. I think there are a few different reasons. One of them is, I think, was a sense of genuine humanitarian concern. Of course, there were other things operating in his mind. There were many other people who had wanted to be involved for a long time in Cuba for other sorts of reasons, imperial control over the Caribbean, et cetera. Nevertheless, I think McKinley did have a genuine sense of concern. Now, the reason why the Philippines came up was because the first battle of the Spanish-American War actually took place in Manila, 9,000 miles away from California, because McKinley wanted to. These were war plans that had dated back several years. Neutralizing Spain's Pacific Fleet was part of the military strategy. Also, they thought it could be used as a bargaining chip in future negotiations if the United States and Spain, after the war ended. The war did end very soon. The United States completely demolished the Spanish. It was not even really a close contest at all. And then and here the United States now has about 11,000 troops in Manila, has control over the city, has neutralized the Spanish fleet there, and is thinking about what to do with it.
Okay.
Yeah. So
is this just out of curiosity? This is me knowing very little. Does this relate to how the United States came to take the California territory? Does this go back that far, or is that totally unrelated?
No, the California precedes the Philippines by quite by a few decades. I think I truly don't think that it's an interesting question.
Thank you.
How far back does the U.S. and there are many historians who kind of look at U.S. Pacific visions of expanding across, and there were fierce imperialists of that era coming into power as president. McKinley was not one of those people, and I think one of the things that is very interesting about him is he had people who Roosevelt, of course, was a sub-cabinet official in his administration. Initially, of course, became vice president in the second term.
We're talking about Teddy.
Roosevelt, excuse me. That's right. Yes. Now, a distant relative of the other Roosevelt, but of course, yes, this is Teddy Roosevelt. One of the things that was going on at the time in the Asia Pacific region, sadly, was an imperial game played primarily by European nations who were all familiar with Germany, United Kingdom, France, Russia, and also the Japanese actually were. So it's not just European countries. Of course, there were other players. In 1897,
Spain would have been one of them as well.
Sorry?
Spain sounds like it was one of them as well.
Spain was. I think Spain was really seen as declining world power at that point. That is one of the reasons why the U.S. defeated it so handily. Spain was still kind of part of that club. And of course, there were other European nations that had Pacific colonies, but these were the sort of the big dogs. And in the context of the Philippines, McKinley, sort of my reading of his decision comes down to two perceptions. One, which was a strategic perception that McKinley felt that if the U.S. were to leave the Philippines, that there would be a power vacuum, that imperial powers would descend, and there would be a great big international war. Now, he felt this way because he did not think these were attitudes at the time. It wasn't, to say that it was one man's decision isn't to say that there were not other influences, social attitudes, other sorts of things very important.
Right.
He sort of felt that the Filipinos lacked the capacity to self-govern. It was a very common perception based on a civilizational outlook that categorized
Bernard Lewis before Bernard Lewis, kind of.
This was
Or Huntington. This is kind of Clash of the Civilizations logic.
It's I don't think he saw it as an inevitability of difference that would lead to civilizational clashes, as much as he saw it as an inevitability of differing levels of civilizational capacity. So, like, if you thought of people as, and these were the terms that were used, barbarians, savages, these are the sorts of, and of course, racial worldviews played quite prominently in these civilizational worldviews, but they weren't everything. There were also religious worldviews. There were also progressive worldviews. McKinley, right, relative to his peers, thought people could progress as in the civilizational hierarchy. Many people, including his Secretary of State, William Day, had less confidence.
So that means that the Filipino community could maybe not govern themselves at that moment in time in 1898, but eventually could in McKinley's mind.
Yeah, this was what he felt. This is what a few people felt, and so thus he thought, this is a very sort of patronizing sort of form of American U.S. tutelage that we can show them how to self-govern. And then, of course, the irony, of course, being that McKinley himself participated in the Civil War in the United States, and would never admit that the United States had issues with self-governing. Nevertheless,
still don't admit it. So not much has changed in about 120 years. But wait, so I interrupted you, but now we're in the Philippines, and McKinley is a key driver. But there's actually something else that you talk about a lot in your research that's really fascinating, and this has to do with prospect theory, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the second perception. Explaining why McKinley feared that there was an international war that might break out is important, but to me, that doesn't actually answer the question why he cared in the first place. Why would McKinley care about this territory 9,000 miles away? And a lot of people, he thought access to the China market, it was the land of riches. And actually, there were people who believed that. I don't think McKinley was one of them. He got a very lukewarm economic report in the fall, right as he was making his decision. He thought maybe there could be something there, but actually the revenues and costs of the Philippines roughly canceled each other out. And actually, if the U.S. had to commit more force, the Philippines would run at a loss. China was only constituted less than 1%, maybe of U.S. Trade. It was just a tiny. It was not a major trading nation. Of course, there's potential that was there, but McKinley was not. He actually was a little skeptical of foreign markets. He thought they were unpredictable.
Okay.
The reason I think he actually cared draws from an intuition from decision science. McKinley used to
just tell us what decision science is. I'm very sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's fine.
Maybe a quick note on what decision science is.
Sure. I mean, in a short way, it's a study of decisions. It's
decision making.
How people make decisions under uncertainty and grapple with differing levels of gambles of benefit and cost and utility. So
this is like how William McKinley made a pros and con list of creating a colony in the Philippines.
In a sense, it's decision science means a lot of different things. I think in this context, in the case of William McKinley, it's what led him to what sort of led him to make this choice. What were the things that he was sort of considering in making his decision? How he was, what the process was of this decision.
Okay.
I think there are many things that were involved. As I mentioned, one of them was this sort of strategic civilizational thing.
Right.
But I think with decision science, there's a psychological element often, or at least a kind of weighing of pros and cons, costs and benefits, et cetera. And with this part of it, I think that there's a finding in decision science, as you mentioned, there's something called prospect theory, which a lot of people are familiar with. Dan Kahneman or Amos Tversky, big luminaries in the field of decision science, psychology, economics. And they had this theory in the 70s. That was actually refined. A part of it was sort of fleshed out by Richard Thaler in 1980. And it was something called the endowment effect that he had coined. And the endowment effect is a finding whereby people tend to overvalue things they own. He sort of found this to be the case. So Zuri, do you drink coffee?
I love coffee.
Okay. Do you have a coffee mug that you use to drink coffee?
Yes.
Okay. So the endowment theory is Zuri would he might have bought this coffee mug for, you like nice coffee and you like nice coffee mugs. So let's say you paid $8 to $10 for this coffee mug. That because you own it, you actually would overvalue its monetary value. You would actually sell it for a price that was greater than you would have paid ex ante before purchasing the coffee mugs. You might sell it for
I would sell it for $12, let's say.
Something like that. That people just tend to overvalue things they feel they own.
Okay.
Or I would say that this finding has been really has been studied for the last several decades. People have refined its underlying explanation. Thaler had used the prospect theory as an explanation. People hate losing things. They hate losing things more than the corresponding gains if they were to gain the same amount, gain the same object. And so that's how he explained it. People since have explained it with other underlying reasons. But nevertheless, the finding has still stuck that people actually still overvalue things that they feel they own. The perception of ownership matters. So I applied this to McKinley's decision.
Okay.
And I applied it because he used language of ownership. So as he was coming to, and this is not just publicly to people or to Congress this was in private. This was in private letters, recollections of his advisors. It was also in public. It's how he thought about it, because the United States was already physically there and had taken control of Manila and Manila Bay before U.S. Army troops had arrived. he would talk about giving the Philippines back, that they are ours. He would use language and framing of ownership. Our flag is there. Who would want to take it down? Like there's this feeling that he knew. I mean, it was clear that the United States didn't legally own certainly hadn't conquered the Philippines, practically speaking, in the hundreds of islands. Nevertheless, this was the language he used. And I thought, oh, there's sort of a stickiness here. He felt that it was and so maybe he thought that it was much more important than it really was to U.S. national interests because the United States was already there. The United States declared war on Spain. They attacked the Philippines. The troops are there, thousands of them. And now actually McKinley, for the first time in his life, as far as I can tell, believes that the Philippines is very important, that a war in the Philippines would be a bad thing for U.S. national interests. Of course, when you think about it objectively, you're an alien looking down at the United States. You would think, why on earth would a war in the Philippines matter to U.S. national interests? It's 9,000 miles away from California. The U.S. doesn't even have a military really to support this annexation. It would have to increase its military. Of course, this is what it does. It has to increase its military. It doesn't have huge trade. McKinley isn't a sort of economic imperialist with respect to China, at least at that time. What is it? And so I sort of think that it had to do with the endowment effect, this sort of stickiness of a military presence.
Okay, well, I mean, so that's interesting. I mean, I often think that my neighbor's house is my house as well. So maybe that's what's happening. But I have as a student of history, not obviously on a level of yourself, but amateurish is what I'll refer to myself as. But there's an argument amongst some Marxist historians that the American involvement in the Philippines is actually a way of getting a market. And you kind of you push this off a little bit. Well, you say this is kind of inadequate as an explanation.
Yeah.
Can you kind of give maybe just a sense of why this doesn't make sense? I mean, obviously, if trade wasn't, it has to do with trade. You've talked about this a little bit, but how do you kind of push away this economic Marxism?
Yeah. So, I mean, it comes down to trying to understand McKinley's mind. I mean, and I said in the beginning, this decision, not all presidential decisions. This decision was really McKinley's. Yes, the Congress had to approve the treaty, and a lot of congressional senators had their various reasons for supporting it. There were imperialists in the Senate. There were people who cared about markets in Asia. So, it's not the case that there was nothing to other kinds of arguments that people might have had. But for the case of McKinley, because Congress would not have, or the Senate would not have annexed the Philippines if McKinley didn't demand from his peace negotiators that they include the Philippines in the negotiations with the Spanish. So to me, McKinley is the most important, the most critical element to understand. He's very difficult to understand. And the reason is because he didn't leave a lot of documents behind. You have to kind of...
like some other presidents that we know.
Sorry. Oh my God. Yes. Right. I mean, who knows? I guess he might have flushed down some of his, I shouldn't laugh about that. I mean, it's terrible, but I think
too soon. It's too soon is what it is.
It's just too soon. He did, he was the first president really to use the telephone with his executive departments, and there weren't records of those calls. He didn't like using letters. He preferred doing diplomacy in person a lot of the time. So he was a secretive president, and therefore is hard to understand.
Interesting.
Nevertheless, I think he can be. You have to wade through the letters of his advisors, wade through his own stuff, look for needles in many needles and many more haystacks. And you can kind of understand what he thought about markets in Asia. I mean, that is the critical question. It's not that economics was completely unimportant to McKinley. He was, money was very important to him. He was, his base, it was the industrial belt. There was something to having. He wanted to have some part of the Philippines, a coaling station, perhaps that would serve some value to American shipping radius. So it's not to say that there was zero importance to money, but the thing is that he was skeptical of overseas markets when he was making this decision. I came across a bunch of speeches he made that are not. And they were hard to find because they were in an advisor's set of documents at the Library of Congress. who most McKinley historians actually don't cite. His speeches from his 1896 campaign. And you can read how skeptical he is about the predictability of foreign markets. He believed that foreign markets were unpredictable, not to be trusted, and the real value, the way to get, the United States had suffered a crushing depression very recently, that the way to lift the United States economically really was to build up the home market. It was the most predictable, so let's build up home demand. So he really wasn't looking abroad to Asia. There were people at that time who were. McKinley just wasn't one of them. And so it was very hard for me to make the argument that that was the most important element in his thinking.
Let me ask you, you know, we get to the Philippines. It's 1898. I think by October, we've got the Paris Peace is completed. What are the immediate impacts? And if you could break this out for me quickly, domestically and then internationally.
Sure. Yeah, huge impacts. I mean, I think if there was one day in American history that was one of the most important days in American relations with Asia, October 28th, the day that McKinley made his decision of annexation, has to be one of them. And the reason is because both, as you put it, both immediate impacts and long-term impacts. The immediate impacts were that the United States became immediately a neighbor of China's. Not only that, it became a major power in Asia. It required a massive expansion of the military. As I said, it had been capped. Interesting detail I found when I was doing my PhD thesis was that there were more American confectioners, as in sort of those who worked in candy and pastry chefs. There were more confectioners, 31,000. I think it was more than twice as many than there were infantry in the U.S. Army. And so, and William McKinley, by the way, was not a militarist, and even though he served in the Civil War, last president to do so, he was proud of a small U.S. military. But now you have this huge country of 8 to 10 million people, size of Arizona geographically, 9,000 miles away from California. You need a larger military to be able to sustain that. So immediately, the United States actually had, and it was boosted because of the war, and it just stayed at a high level. It never dipped below 100,000 people again. It also led to hundreds of thousands of or over the course of a few years, Filipinos dying. The Filipinos naturally didn't want to be traded from one imperialist ruler to another. And so there was a war, the Philippine-American War. Hundreds of thousands died, actually from disease and starvation, but basically in what were concentration camps that were used to separate the slightly different from the later iterations, but very similar to the concentration camps Spain had used in Cuba, rife with disease and starvation. Of course, in that way, they were similar to later iterations. They were used to separate rebels from locals who the United States felt were
kind of what would happen in Malaya, maybe about a half century later.
It was really sad. I mean, it was, the sort of suffering, and that was where the bulk of Filipino deaths actually came from, were from these starvation and disease. So those were big immediate impacts. Internationally, it reorganized the balance of power in Asia. The U.S. was now quite a imperial player in the Asia Pacific, now Indo-Pacific as it's called. Although back then, of course, they didn't use the phrase Indo-Pacific.
What was it called then?
The Far East.
Okay. That would give Edward Said an aneurysm, but thankfully he's not here right now. Let me ask you this. I think that there's a common thinking amongst maybe people in the policy community in DC, but I think also, when you think about World War I, I think there's a common argument made that the United States vaulted into global leadership after World War I, right? There's a tension. All the world powers of the other world powers are kind of dealing with the consequences of World War I, but the United States kind of comes off scot-free. And then there's this debate: do we go back to being an isolationist power? And then this kind of gets resolved around World War II. Obviously, Stephen Wertheim writes a book about this.
Yeah.
But could you make an argument that this is the moment where the fortunes of the United States change? That this is the moment where the United States enters the conversation as one of, if not the great power of the 20th century?
Oh, for sure. I mean, in fact, and the United States knows it too. They call themselves as being part of the powers. That phrase is used. Great powers. In a shortened version, the powers. And this includes all the usual suspects. Italy is usually also included in this list.
Wow, that didn't last too long.
No. I mean, and the Turks too, although of course less so in the Far East. We weren't not really, but I mean, generally speaking, there was probably a group of 8 to 10 countries. My feeling is that the U.S. became a major power, a great power on the world stage after 1898. And actually, it was over the course of the two presidencies. There was various things. We talked about hosting peace negotiations. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, did that. McKinley did not. But it changed. It definitely. I mean, it wasn't the same. It's not to say that the United States after in the early 1900s was exactly the way it looked in the after World War II. It's not. I mean, it was it was much larger power at that stage. Nevertheless, in the eyes of other countries, and you can also see it with respect to embassies, as we were talking about earlier, the United States over the course of the 1890s, it started before the Spanish-American War, but really afterwards, there was a great expansion and also the recognition of this great power status. The United States had ambassadors, had embassies around the world, and it could sustain that kind of diplomacy. One quick thing I wanted to mention before, and this I guess relates to this point, is about these longer term effects. We didn't really get into too much, but one of the longer term effects, of course,
it was my next question, actually.
Being a great power, I think it really actually changed the United States' relationship with the Pacific Ocean. People don't tend to talk about a relationship with an ocean, but ocean is a security blanket in many ways, and I think it changed from being a security blanket to a vulnerability. And I think because we have this thing so far away, the Pacific Ocean is now actually you have to cross it to defend your territory. In Teddy Roosevelt, who was somebody who actually supported the annexation of the Philippines in 1907, called it our heel of Achilles. He wrote, "They are all that makes the present situation with Japan dangerous." So it's almost like this vector that's far away that now is actually a vulnerability because we have it. And it also, so you kind of become more sensitive to security threats when you have this territory. Mm-hmm. And it also makes it easier to send troops elsewhere. Oh, now we think China's important. McKinley sent troops to help suppress the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. He drew troops from the Philippines. Woodrow Wilson drew troops from the Philippines when he intervened in the Russian Civil War. He drew thousands of troops from the Philippines. So, it's easier to draw troops from there. You feel more vulnerable in certain ways because you have this territory that's hard to defend. And I think those are longer term sorts of things that shape the contours of U.S. Presence in Asia over the course of the 20th century.
Well, obviously we can talk about, obviously there's some obvious questions I could ask about, World War II, Japan, and then obviously I have to make the joke about the stopping power of water, because what would a conversation about political science be without a reference to John Mearsheimer? But we've been chatting for about 30 minutes, and I would love to ask you for some concluding remarks, right?
Yeah.
Potentially, what are some lessons that we can draw for today, just as people who are curious about the world, and then maybe think through some interesting future questions that we need to be looking at as a result of your research.
Thanks. Yeah, I think there are a few things we can draw. It is one single historical case. Although I think there are some political scientists who believe you can draw from a single case. So
look, China is a single case, right? There are people who spend a lot of time working on China. It's a single case. But you can get variation within cases.
I think so too. I think one of the things that this helps teach us is that, especially with respect for today, is that interest. Of course, you sort of think interest drive military presence, and of course that's true in a lot of ways. I think what this shows us is also military presence can drive interests, and that they can be sticky. And I think that's, we don't think of it as, we usually think of it as the other way around. But when you think of it as, oh my gosh, it's become a national interest because we've sent sent troops, that it actually inflates our feeling. And for the case of McKinley, inflates his valuation of the importance of the Philippines.
So almost like if you have a hammer, everything becomes a nail.
I think it's more, there's a little bit of that. I think it's more that, yeah, it's a little bit of that. I think it's also different from that. I think it's more like, it's more like I have this hammer that I don't need, but I think it's still important, and I don't have any nails.
Okay.
And you're like, but why? Why do you need to? Why do you? And actually, it's even less. It's more like a huge hammer that you cannot use for anything that you think is important, and you don't have any huge nails to. It's sort of like this. It's not like he thought that the Philippines was going to be of future benefit. Maybe people might keep a hammer for future benefit. It was sort of like he just sort of thought it was important. Philippines was important, but I'm really talking about importance to U.S. national interests. I should clarify that. I think this can be related a little bit to the war in Afghanistan. I think future historians will be curious about why the United States spent 20 years, why we thought it was so important for 20. Of course, there's very good reason to think about why it was important initially. Do we think it was then important right at the end because it was just, we had people there, we thought it was still important? Were we inflating its security importance to the United States? Of course, the people there, very important. There have been tragic developments, of course. But again, we're talking about its sort of strategic relevance to U.S. national interests. I think a couple other very quick lessons. There's a humility you've learned from these sorts of historical cases about what we can't control in the world, that not every sort of corner is critical to U.S. national interests. I think there's a lesson of psychological biases the mundaneness, I think the everydayness of the endowment effect and prospect theory that affects all people is what is so shocking to the conscience to me. That it is something that is so present that we don't even think about it. And I think, as you put it, with respect to the tools, I think that when you overvalue physical presence, presence and ownership, I think maybe we should design this relates to future research. I think there hopefully could be some future research designed around this. I think my suspicion, I don't know this is, my suspicion is that it underweights the importance of less salient forms of statecraft, economic statecraft, intelligence, diplomatic statecraft. The military is very important. Military statecraft is important. But of course, there are other tools in the toolkit too. And I'm sort of concerned that, that we might downplay those because physical presence, carries so much psychological kind of importance.
I think those are powerful points. I think it's interesting you bring up Afghanistan because at the time, the Philippines was the longest war the United States had ever fought, and Afghanistan has now become that. And also, thinking about the military tool of policy, obviously, there's a big concern, I think, in the restraint community, but also I think in American foreign policy, kind of increasingly at the kind of larger level, that our policy is overly militarized. And so it seems to be that that's like a common thread that we're pulling on.
Yeah. The worry, there of course are many good reasons to have a military and use a military. But, and this was a point at which the United States, it had a small military, but you can see how this one situation then led to, I should say there were military strategists who wanted large militaries, but if you read the reports of annual, which I've done incidentally, the annual reports during the late 1870s, early 1880s and 1890s from the War Department and the Navy Department, they were pretty deferential to civilian leadership and the size of the U.S. military. Mm-hmm. They were very rarely, definitely not the War Department. The Navy maybe went back and forth a little bit, but even still, was fairly deferential. And
Okay.
this started to change. Now, it wasn't only because of the Spanish-American War, but it was a huge sort of boost. Now there's this huge presence. We've got this huge sort of military, and you can sort of, and so the idea of cutting back becomes very hard.
There's a tendency to it.
Yeah, I think there's something to it. And so anyway, there wasn't the same sort of situation with private companies. As we sort of, the military industrial complex as we sort of think about it today after World War II. So it's not the same, but I think there's some kinds of analogies that can be drawn. I think a couple other lessons for future research. I think people have got to consider the mundane and and uncertainty when analyzing decisions and understanding. I think people, this is another sort of lesson, is confusing intentions with outcomes. Of course, an outcome was the U.S. became a colonial power. That's true. We had colonial control over the Philippines for several decades, among other places, of course. But to me, I think what is so kind of shocking is the fact that it was McKinley was making this judgment under uncertainty. That's just decision science. He was making this judgment under uncertainty. And it was a mundane, to me, it was a kind of mundane, everyday kind of framing of the issue that affected it. That's not to absolve him of the decision. I mean, it's to explain it. And I think that actually is more shocking to the conscience than a sort of fierce imperialist as there were other people around. I think lastly, thinking broadly and about looking to other disciplines to inform historical research, I think things like psychology, economics, political science have a range of theories, tools, analytical tools that historians do not use enough, I think, to explain historical occurrences. So I think it's an opportunity in studying leaders and past decisions to kind of have a cross-disciplinary pollination of ideas.
I mean, that's a wonderful way to wrap up this discussion. I would offer that, from a political scientist perspective, you can think about the debate within international relations about the power of individuals, which I think you're focused on in your work, right? Yeah. Decision theory versus the systemic kind of structural issues that might have pushed McKinley to this decision. But I think that'll be a conversation for another time. You've given us a tremendous amount of your time, and this has been an insightful conversation. Thank you so much for helping me kick off on Target, and I'm grateful to you, and I hope we get a chance to talk again.
Yeah, I hope so too. Thanks so much, Zuri.
Thank you.